An Indian rhinoceros arrived in Lisbon, Portugal in 1515, a gift from a sultan to a king. A living rhinoceros had not been seen in Europe for over 1,000 years, and over this time its reputation had been conflated to the mythical status of a faun or unicorn. It became an instant sensation. In the context of the Renaissance, it was regarded as a rediscovery from classical antiquity, worthy of interest and study. It was examined by scholars and the curious. A merchant described it in a letter to a friend. An artist made a sketch. After just 8 weeks in Lisbon, the first known rhinoceros woodcut was published, a rudimentary illustration for a poem. These fragments of information were gathered in Nuremberg, Germany, by a master of the Northern Renaissance, Albrecht Durer. The German word for the desire to discover hidden knowledge is Neugier, lust for the new. And when Durer experienced Neugier, he had a habit of assimilating his findings in his work. In the past, he had rendered a woodcut of a pig with 2 conjoined bodies. And whilst his contemporaries dismissed insects as unworthy of depiction, Durer painted one of the earliest European portrayals of an identifiable species of stag beetle. Durer had a remarkable instinct for making art that sells. His conventional content was religious imagery, a popular subject matter for consumers in the late Middle Ages. He was capable of spectacular paintings such as Adoration of the Magi, Feast of Rosary, and Christ among the Doctors. And his abilities in printmaking were phenomenal, exemplified in engravings Melancholia, Night, Death and the Devil, and 15 Woodcuts of Apocalypse. Durer made a departure from his usual religious themes to concentrate his efforts on the rhinoceros. The novelty of the rhinoceros would soon perish, and anticipating its ephemeral popularity, he initiated urgent image production. His interest in the animal was not purely for personal satisfaction, but in benefiting financially from a lucrative commercial venture. He felt pressured to get the image into the market whilst there was demand, so he could make a profit. As paintings were more expensive and time-consuming to create, Durer decided to produce prints instead. He was a printmaker with a high level of creative control over production due to owning his own print press and his own workshop. Mass-producing cheap prints made art objects affordable for collectors and gave them opportunity to buy the iconic, exotic animal, a Durer product. Durer determined not to make detailed and refined engravings, but instead chose the quickest method available, a woodcut. Woodblock printing was a collaborative workshop trade and had been used predominantly for book illustrations before Durer began to use the process to make art. Durer designed the rhinoceros in pen and ink on paper. The initial drawing was transferred to a block of fruitwood. The space around the drawing on the fruitwood was carved out, leaving the lines raised in relief. The woodcut was then inked and printed. Due to the printing technique and considerations of composition, the image is mirrored. Above the rhinoceros is an inscription in the German vernacular that borrows heavily from a description by Pliny the Elder, an author from the early Roman Empire. The writing reports that the image is an accurate representation of a rhinoceros. The information mentions the animal's colours as those of a speckled tortoise, its body covered in scales, and it's the size of an elephant, but with shorter legs. The text also mentions the rhinoceros as the mortal enemy of the elephant, and its ability to rip open an elephant's stomach with its horn. Durer's rhinoceros is not an accurate representation. There are major anatomical inaccuracies. He depicted the rhinoceros as naturalistically as he could, based on the limited information he received. Unburdened by the presence of the animal, Durer used artistic license to invent an imaginative creature from loose facts and intuition. These elements of fantasy render the image profoundly memorable. Durer's rhinoceros is a mixture of misunderstandings and creative additions. Durer was familiar with common animals such as cows, dogs, and horses, so he borrowed their features extensively, transplanting ears, whiskers, and hooves onto his rhinoceros. The eye looks distinctively human, and the spiral horn on the back resembles an auger shell. The verbal description presented Durer with the notion of scales and a tortoise shell instead of skin. The body looks like it's been covered by a giant breastplate, the throat covered by a gorget, and the seams connected by iron rivets. The legs are scales of chainmail, and the rear is jagged as a saw. It's a suit of armour forged for the rhinoceros, forced to fight an elephant in Portugal. The body's form is heavy and exquisitely textured, with subtle details and tonal complexity of cross-hatching. Confined in the box, the body is squashed in, with the horn pushing against the frame, conveying its gigantic size. The warts on the shoulders and back legs convey dermatitis induced by the challenging conditions of the journey from India to Portugal. From Portugal, the king decided to ship the rhinoceros to the Pope, but the boat sank in a storm, and the rhinoceros drowned. There would not be another rhinoceros in Europe for another 60 years. The German printmaker Hans Buchmeyer executed a woodcut depicting the same rhinoceros in the same period. Despite his version being more naturalistic and featuring authentic chains and shackles, Europeans continued to regard Durer's depiction to be the archetypal rhinoceros even into the late 18th century. Acquiring Durer's fanciful prints was fashionable, and due to the artist's prestige and the public's appetite for the bizarre, his prints were disseminated across Europe. Durer's signature monogram, with its initials AD, was a valuable hallmark, an emblem signalling the authority of its authorship. In the 1740s, when Clara the rhinoceros toured Europe and was immortalized in paintings by artists such as Jean-Baptiste Audry and Pietro Longhi, public opinions began to change, and the impression that Durer's rhinoceros left on European consciousness gradually faded.